the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Welcome back, OnScripters. This is Matt Lynch. I co-host the podcast along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, and on the rare occasion, Chris Tilling. And on our still new theology stream, Amy Brown Hughes is the host of that part of OnScript. A quick shout out to Ed Hatke for his production help once again, to Rebecca Terhune and Tommy Molman for marketing assistance, and to all those who give to OnScript to help make this viable. Thank you so much for your help. You've been able to keep us rolling. If you haven't yet given us an iTunes or whatever other platform you use rating, could you please do us a favor and do so? That would be most appreciated. Enjoy this episode, hosted by Drew Johnson.
The Hebrew Scriptures open with a series of horrific stories about murder, prostitution, and daughter-on-father sexual assault. These stories all appear just in the first half of the book of Genesis, and they're all being perpetrated by Abraham and his relatives. Literarily speaking, this is a bold move. Theologically speaking, that seems problematic at the very least. But what role should horror have in our culture and our theology? And how do our experiences with trauma and horror shape our reading of Scripture and shape our contemporary theology? Today I have with me Scott Harrower, who is a lecturer in Christian thought at Ridley College in Melbourne, Australia. He's got a few books out before this one, which include Trinitarian Self and Salvation, Raised from Obscurity, a narratival and theological study of characterization of women in Luke Acts, and Trinity Without Hierarchy, Reclaiming Nicene Orthodoxy and Evangelical Theology with Mike Bird. And he's also co-editing with Michael Bird, the Cambridge Companion of the Apostolic Fathers, due out in 2020. But today we're going to be talking with Scott about his new book, God of All Comfort, a Trinitarian response to the horrors of this world, put out by Lexham Press in 2019. And I want to be careful to say that every mention of the word horror is horror and not whore.
That's right. G'day. Good to speak with you, mate.
Bienvenidos a OnScript, Scott. Primero, ¿podemos continuar la entrevista en español?
Sí, si querés podemos hablar español. No es problema.
Lo siento, no es posible. Recordé, no hablo español, solamente inglés.
Yeah, okay. I'm better off in English too, so let's do that. But hey, good Spanish, Drew, mate. That's all right.
Fake it till you make it. That's what I say.
Fake it till you make it.
It's been my professorial mantra.
No worries, no worries.
Very welcome. And it is 4 p.m. here in New York City and 6 a.m. for Scott in Melbourne, Australia. So thank you very much for joining us at this unsightly hour. So I really enjoyed this book. And a full disclosure, I actually endorsed the book in the back. But even if I hadn't endorsed it, I would still enjoy the book immensely. And I think, a book like this clearly comes from somewhere. It's obvious, even as I was reading, that this was not just a pet topic that you thought would be interesting to pick up, but that it came from somewhere deep within you and your experiences and your theology. So I wonder if you could tell us, how did you get interested in this topic? And I know just a little, I know enough to know that you have a Goth background.
Yeah, sure.
And so
absolutely.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it as well.
Sure. Yeah, it is true. You and I first met and connected over punk and goth music, and that genre is one that picks up, these themes of disintegration, wasting away, nothingness. And yeah, that's the kind of music that always resonated with me. I guess because I grew up in South America during a military dictatorship, a war, lots of people were disappearing, and I got to see many horrors. I guess that's the starting point for the book, personally. However, I also believe that right now we're kind of in a bit of a crisis of horrors where we're at. I think people are aware of horror in a way that we haven't been in the past. We see it on news shows all the time when there's a shooting or a stabbing or a truck decides to run through crowds of people. We see it all the time, and also our culture's producing lots of horror-related products, which is our way of digesting the horrors. So like we're all watching zombie series. Game of Thrones is essentially a series of horrors, and these shows give us the opportunity to sort of digest them at a safe distance, but it's the kind of stuff with which we're becoming very, very familiar.
Yeah, even that little intro into how you got interested already begs the question, can you define horror from us, and maybe what's the difference between trauma and horror, and why it's so important to have what you call a horror-attuned reading of Scripture? We'll get to the horror-attuned reading of Scripture later, but what is horror?
Yeah, so I guess something else I should say by way of background was one morning I arrived at work ready to teach. I think it was church history, and there'd been a huge bombing in England that had involved a lot of Aussies at this pub where there'd been a huge attack. And over half our students had family or friends in England. And I remember them just looking at me as if I had to say something on horrors. And what the hell's going on? And that's where this model I give for what a horror comes from. It's from trying to explain what's going on to students. I mean, it also comes out of my teaching experience. And the first point I'd make is that a horror is something that is a movement from death to life. It's an objective a reality in which there's a degeneration, a movement from death to life. And that's the key point with a horror. And when we have a movement from death to life, something happens in a person's life in that there's a replacement of good things with lesser goods or actually evil things. So that's the main criterion for horror. And then I have 4 other aspects of what may be the case in a horror. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, and I think the 4 other aspects, one thing I liked is you either flirt with or are an analytic theologian. I haven't quite figured you out yet because you seem to make so much sense. I'll
tell you how it works. I went to Trinity to do my Ph.D. on Karl Rahner, who's continental. And then I stumbled over Tom McCall and Keith Yandel, who were analytic. And Tom McCall was the second reader of my PhD, so I thought I'd better get my act together and be clearer than a German continental theologian.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I actually was originally going to do my PhD on Karl Rahner and sacramental theology.
Oh, my goodness. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. I don't know why. I was just so drawn to him.
Okay, we'll have to save that for the Karl Rahner podcast.
Yeah. But you had these, you had that very broad definition of horror, but then you make distinctions what it is and what it isn't, or possible cases where it could be and where it couldn't. So how do those work? Yeah,
sure. So in addition to a horror having to include a movement from death to life, there are 4 smaller aspects which may be the case and often are the case. And these include the fact that a horror is sourced in an objective, malevolent willing. That's often the case, for example, when someone is violently assaulted. Secondly, a horror prevents a person from both being and allowing others to fully be an image of God as they have made. So it prevents our flourishing, but it also prevents us being there to allow others to flourish, to service them. Another aspect of horrors is that it often entails a traumatic response. And that's where we find the difference between a horror and trauma, which we'll get to in a second. And then fifthly, I argue that it's not fully possible to recover psychologically and relationally from a horror. That's what makes a horror, is that even though you might recover to a large extent, you actually can't fully recover from it. So there are 4 sub-points of what makes a horror a horror. That's why horrors are so significant.
And that last sub-point is, I remember writing in my margins of the book, like that just hurts because the power of it is so palpable. And I think in psychology, they used to call it psychological scarring or psychic scarring. But it's difficult, I think, for a lot of Christians who we focus on everything through a redemptive lens. And so we just assume, and you do a great job later in the book of pointing out in the Gospels how this actually works out as well.
Yeah, sure. And so one of the keys in this book was not to begin with, Pauline theology or the story of redemption, but actually to begin in Genesis with what is good, what shalom is, who we are. That way we can really point out how heavy horrors are and how bad they are. And that in turn points out like the good news of the gospel and are called to be, shining like stars in the Father's kingdom. But we need to reckon with horrors by understanding exactly how bad they are. It's a big commitment in this book is we need to be realists, and if we're not realists, then our worldview fails the pragmatic criterion, which means we may as well believe in gnomes or, kangaroo gods or whatever.
You're right. And it's one of the things I found, sorry to keep talking about the nature of the book itself, but I have sometimes, I won't say always, but I've sometimes found analytic theology or systematic theology to sometimes skirt and flirt with the problem. They discuss reality in a way that almost seems a little fairy tale-ish to me, or a little too cut and dry. And I think that's a common critique, although I think it's not as bad now as maybe it used to be in the medieval period. Although the medieval period, but the medieval period actually they were very sober in some ways in which we're not.
They were.
But you just ride this line throughout the book of we never escape, because of the topic, we never escape the cold hard realities of life and how these are affecting and shaping us as the people of God and those outside the kingdom. But also, you're always giving us incisive kind of rubrics and routes to think about the topic and also to act, which I sincerely appreciated, because I think most everything I write, I fail to include, here's how to act. So I don't want to tell anybody what to do because I know I don't have the wisdom to back it up. But going back to the issue, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, well, while we're on your work on ritual, one of the important aspects of recovery from trauma is how you use the body, actually. So when you write about ritual and learning through being together and actions, that's certainly an important part of what people writing on recovery from horrors need to include. So that's just me saying that I think your work's actually quite relevant to the practices that communities and individuals require in order to overcome horrors and to embody something new that's come about and learn through that.
Yeah. I hadn't put those two things together, but in this new book on rituals, I did a little work on, just looked into EMDR therapy and Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, the trauma stuff. And I found it fascinating how they're using these strange rituals to kind of, to help people separate themselves from their traumas. And there's lots of interesting stuff in trauma research, which is a developing field within theology and biblical studies. But could you said it very quickly, but maybe a little bit more carefully tease out the difference between the trauma as a response and the horror as an event, I guess?
Yeah, so there are objective horrors. So they're horrors that might be, say, the mutilation of our arms, or somebody beats us to break our will, or we are raped. Then there are subjective horrors, which is the horrors of perception, that we believe that we're being hunted down, and that's grounded in other experiences often. Now, both of those cause a response, and that's a trauma response. So when we talk about someone who is a trauma survivor, it means that they are someone who's experienced horrors, and they have found the horrors so overwhelming, and may continue to experience them, that there is a fracture in their memory and their approach to reality and their perception, such that they cannot integrate this huge, awful event that's happening to them, and that it provokes a trauma response, which is essentially they feel overwhelmed, they lose a sense of agency. Ideas such as hope, meaning, is their life a good thing? Can good come out of it? All those things are wither and almost disappear. So being someone who is a survivor of trauma or traumatized is someone who's having a huge response to horrors themselves. And that's the link between horrors and trauma. Speaking
of horrors and traumas, this is a very minor one, but horror films, the genre of horror films, and I remember, I can give you two films, and I think we talked about one of these last time we were together, two films that traumatized me as a young person, but they were not, neither of them were horror films. One was, you're the one who gave me the title, was Fortress, the Australian film from 1985, which is about the kidnapping of children and a teacher by these men in these Santa Claus mask and mouse mask and all these other things. And then Red Dawn from 1984, which in vivid color illustrated the terrifying reality of an invasion of our country or whatever. And I remember both of those, I would lay awake at night very worried because of both of those movies. And what's, I guess, interesting about that for me is neither of them are horror films. They're both like action, thriller, whatever. But I still to this day shudder a little bit when I see pictures or stills from those movies. And the Fortress one is interesting to me because until I was talking to you, I had completely forgotten about the movie, shut it out or something. And then I was reading in your book as well. You almost casually note that Australians, their view of nature and their view of the landscape itself, they view in a completely different way than Americans think about nature and landscape, right? And so maybe we could connect these two, because I think a Fortress is the perfect storm there of using both nature and the horrors of what that men perpetrate on each other and combining them. And maybe that's why I got so scarified. I don't know.
Sure. I guess the book, because it was generated in part by the classroom questions and the need to say something to Aussie students after seeing the horrors of terrorism, has meant that it's a folk theology. This book is a Aussie response to horrors, right? So that's the starting point. So that meant that for me, I had a good reason to pause and think, okay, I'm responding to horrors from an Aussie perspective. What does that include? So it meant that I slowed down and I just took into account our history. For example, you guys in the States were very fortunate that as cultures of different kinds have thrived in your continent, you have found forests and trees and streams. And yes, there are deserts and places like Utah and Arizona and everything. But overwhelmingly, it's a fertile place. For us, our explorers hit the green patches on the coast and then slowly moved inland, assuming it was going to be fertile. And they died on the way. They named mountains like Mount Disappointment, Mount Despair, and then they died. I mean, that's our history. So in Australian writing, there's a strong thread that I mentioned, which is this sense that the land itself doesn't want you here and that it's a threat. We have all kind of little beasties here that are a problem. My dad worked in Tasmania, and when he got bitten by a snake, he knew he had to go to hospital immediately because there's no non-poisonous snakes. Yeah, so it's that kind of place. And it certainly adds to a sense that life is dangerous and unpredictable, and a sense of security is a facade because tomorrow we might die. I was down at the beach the last few days with my kids, and we were jumping off rocks into the surf and swimming into really deep pools of water. But any second, a great white could have just come and had us as a snack. And you just know that, and that's just the way it is, so it makes you paddle faster.
My kids used to watch all those nature shows, top 72 deadly predators in the world. And 1 through 60 are in Australia. And the rest are in Africa.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So
if it's not the animals, it's the sky. The sun will, just burn you to death. Or absolutely. If you go in the water, the sharks will get you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that sense compounds a sense of threat that there is in the air, and also that perhaps you might never recover, because as much as we have first world technologies over here, for example, when my dad got bitten by a snake, they were in a remote location. Yesterday at the beach, if one of us had got slammed against the rocks or chomped by a shark, it's a long way for you to get treatment. So things might not work out. And that's a deep assumption within us, which just makes a lot of fields, like my wife works in domestic violence as a social worker, just means that recovery in lots of fields and domains of life is something slower, a bit more difficult and quite challenging over here. So that's why an Aussie approach to horrors and trauma I thought was warranted.
That's interesting. Yeah, because we learned this in Scotland, because I think Scotland has a similar, things go wrong, things are rough, people suffer, that's just the way it is. And it really struck us as Americans, we do not have this theory of life at all. If something's going wrong, let's fix it. Let's fix it now. And why can't we fix this?
Yeah, and things aren't fixable. I think horrors bring that out. And that's one of the criteria of horror. You don't recover from these things. And so trauma studies has really wanted to say, how do you live in the aftermath of the storm? And one of the big questions is that trauma and horrors remain with you always. So what does it mean that God is with us, He's trying to work with us, in a circumstance in which things will never be the way we want it to be? So clearly you could have bitterness, disappointment, anger, a search for revenge built into your very core after horrors. And if you're in a place where you're not going to recover, well, you've got really deep questions. And if we can't answer those questions, I think, we fail the pragmatic criterion and our worldview is useless. So it's a big problem.
Yeah. And I mean, even on that front, you noted, the issue is not just people who've been victimized and who are now traumatized, but also that the victimizers are equally traumatized. And as we learned from Rwanda, I guess, as one key example that Americans always point to is that the issue, the damage done to those who victimize, they don't. How would you put it? You have to actually have a sense of grace and sympathy for the people who perpetrated the violence in order for a society to recover from the violence, which is, I can't think of a more difficult task in front of anybody.
Yeah, so being a horror maker is a huge problem, and as the book evolves, it becomes a more prominent theme. I didn't want to put it up front together with the problem of horrors because it was just too much. I started that way, but the book was just so dark you may as well be reading Nietzsche.
As a Nietzschephile, I take umbrage with that.
So the problem of being a horror maker is one of the problems I tackle in the book, and there's a lot of literature out there to do with a moral injury, that when you commit horrors against another person, you actually commit a moral injury against yourself. So that means you no longer see yourself as safe and trustworthy. So add that onto the fact that life is inherently unpredictable, dangerous, and ends in death. If you have a moral injury and you don't trust yourself, well, you end up quite lost. And for us here in Victoria, where I live, we have a huge problem with drug addiction and domestic violence. And people commit all sorts of horrors, sometimes under the influence of drugs and alcohol, but other times just because we are horror makers and we target and victimize and beat people and reduce them to nothing. And we live as horror makers with this terrible guilt. And one of the big questions in Australia is, as a secular nation, where does forgiveness fit in? How does healing occur within a person? And what I wanted to do in this book is add the theological dimension to the psychological and the social dimensions of recovering as a survivor of horrors and also as a horror maker.
Yeah, and this is not an anthropological or sociological study. It brings in all of those aspects, but you focus it towards the end on, well, how do we read Scripture and then the Trinity? So I wonder, how does all of this shape what you call into a horror-attuned reading of Scripture? You focused on particularly on Matthew, but feel free to speak from any part you want.
No, sure. Look, I'll tell you a little story that is some of the background to this. So I've been working out for quite a long time, and during that time I've made some really good friendships. And I've had two long-term training partners at different points who decided that they were happy to read the Bible with me. And they were both non-Christians. And what struck me about that experience with both of them was that as we tried to read Matthew in one case and Luke in the other, that because they had grown up here and had been involved in violence, and one of them was an addict and so forth, is that when they read the Bible, they had so many inbuilt assumptions about how dangerous the world was, how there's this eventual movement towards decay, that when they read, for example, the massacre of the innocents in Matthew, they freaked out. And it seemed that the Bible just reinforced everything they knew about the world being a hideous place. And Jesus was just another kind of pretender, a cult leader amongst many, for example, rather than reading him and going, oh, wow, Jesus is fantastic. So I guess through reading the Bible with non-Christians from difficult backgrounds, I realized that when you read the Bible from that background, you read it in an entirely different way. So my aim was to show what a horror-attuned or horror-sensitive reading of the Bible might look like for people who are trauma survivors. That way, those of us who haven't experienced traumas can see through their eyes what the Gospels might look like and be empathetic with them. So it's an exercise, firstly, in empathy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people listening, will ask themselves, wait, have I experienced a horror? Am I a trauma? I mean, this is the typical American way forward is, I might be a victim here. Let me stop and check.
Very possibly.
But I think for many of us, and some people will be. They'll actually go, oh, okay, this is actually describing what happened to me. This explains some of the things that I think about myself. And then some of us are going to say, well, we've never really had any, maybe I was bullied in school, but nothing really horror, the movies are the worst thing that happened to me. So, I mean, just on a practical theological level, do you seek out people who, A, how do you find these people? B, if you experience horror to the point that it's traumatized you, most people aren't going to want to talk about that openly. But it almost sounds like it's necessary. I mean, that's where I started in the book. I started with this is interesting, and I quickly flipped into, oh, this is necessary. So I wonder, we have a field called feminist theology or queer theology where we're reading people who are coming from that specific direction. So apart from finding a workout partner, do you have any suggestions for how people should go about learning the skill of listening to the text this way?
Yeah, look, I actually think it's a huge thing, Drew, and I think it's part of being responsible and living up to understanding the rights and responsibilities we have with other human beings. So when I deal with another person, and this applies to us all, we need to be good listeners of what's going on. And sometimes if we're from, and luckily from a safe background ourselves, we might not hear what's going on and what has happened with them. And one of the issues in the church, in Australia anyway, over the last 30 years is that we haven't listened to the stories of sexual abuse victims in particular within the church. We just haven't had a radar for that. We haven't been interested in that. We haven't been attuned to that. We've been scared and we haven't known what to do. But I think that a horror-attuned reading means that we need to be empathetic and sensitive listeners to others and take it seriously when people read, for example, the resurrection and ascension narrative of Jesus, and it seems like some of his disciples worship him, some doubt him, and then he just takes off. And then the disciples get slaughtered around the Mediterranean. Like, that's just terrible. So we need to take it seriously when people think that Jesus has abandoned his disciples, and that echoes very deeply with a sense of abandonment that they might have within them. So I think, it's I guess like other readings that emerge generated by issues in society. A horror-attuned reading, I think, is a necessary reading, and it's really important to pastoral care and being people who are there for one another as servants. Just let me add one more dimension. In Australia, one thing that's happened in churches is that pastoral care has essentially been outsourced to counsellors. So ministers aren't visiting others in their homes. They're not alongside you. They're not listening to you. And I think that's a problem because Christians don't have other Christians who are there to listen to what they've gone through, which is very different to talking to a counsellor. So I think that we need to be particularly attuned to listening to others and hearing what they experience and how they read the Bible with respect to horror and trauma, and being willing to sit there with them and actually invest the time and the relational energy into them.
Yeah, I think that's desperately important. I mean, I'm very glad that Christian counseling has a common stock place in the United States. But yeah, it seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, sorry, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it's an important one. My conception of this has been it's important to hear from others who have common experience because when you go to a counselor, it's such an isolated and heightened situation. But a lot of the comfort I've drawn, especially when I was young and a new Christian, a lot of comfort I drew about my life circumstances was, oh, this happened to you as well. Okay, you're a normal person. Things turn out. You're married. You're okay. Just seeing the other side of the, how this looks 10 years later and how it can look in a good situation was very important.
Yeah, sure. And I should clarify that our counsellors in Australia are mostly non-Christians because we have very few Christians here. So if you go to a counsellor and you're describing either being a horror maker because you tortured pets as a kid, or you've experienced horrors yourself, the last thing you're going to do is whip out a sacred text. That is kind of extremist thinking over here. So you can't digest these biblical stories that seem to enforce a horror and trauma reality with a secular counsellor. So if Christians aren't being there for one another, listening empathetically for a horror-attuned reading of the Bible, then you're going to have these Christians who are isolated, which is one of the issues of trauma, trying to make sense of the disturbing stories in the Bible all by themselves, which will perpetuate, I believe, trauma and feelings of alienation and the strangeness of God.
Yeah. I teach the Old Testament every semester, so of course I'm having to deal with all of these rapes and sexual assaults, and I know in the room that I always have people who have suffered from these things, and even reading your book again, it made me think I need to revisit how I'm doing this strategically. But I think methodologically, you're saying horror-tuned reading, but the first thing I'm hearing is we need to pause and let the horror be real to us before. I think our temptation is to jump to the end and go, but no, it all works out in the end. Get their soul saved and we're fine, or Jesus is going to come back and fix everything. But there's a sense of staying in the time, in the text, and letting the horror be real, soak in, so that we can also appreciate the eschatological consequence of this.
Yeah,
as well.
we definitely need to sit with it, and it's important to do that because as we sit with how hideous these texts are, it helps us to understand how hideous the damage and the reductions are that happen to us as people. So let's think about our students that are in our classes for an instance. They have been impacted by horror, which means that relationally they're less able to engage with us and other students. Morally, they are sort of in a more ambiguous and liminal situation because they've experienced hugely immoral acts. And creatively and functionally, they will have less confidence and less agency as trauma survivors. So that means that if we don't engage with the text and are not appreciating these angles, at the same time, we're not going to be appreciating the damage done to our students. So there's two things going on at once. It's not just the problem isn't that we're just going to ignore what's happening in text. It's we're going to be at the same time ignoring the damage done to our students.
Right, exegeting text and exegeting the classroom.
Yeah, I'll tell you about this really weird experience I had. I teach apologetics every 2 semesters. And the first time I taught it here in Australia after coming back from the States, I just did 1 week on the problem of evil. It was essentially the logical problem of evil. So I was discussing Hume and all this kind of abstractish stuff on the problem of evil, philosophy, religion, inclined stuff. And it gradually dawned on me that my pastor radar was up and that there was all this anger in the class. And then I realized essentially the class became pastoral care for the class because there's all this anger at God underneath the surface. I even heard from one student that when they watched the Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, they kind of liked the fact that Jesus got beaten and tortured very badly because he was like, finally God gets it. You know what I mean? So, yeah, there are deeply wounded students in our classes. And so now I do 3 weeks on the problem of evil, and we have to break it down very carefully. Like, we need to do apologetics within the Christian community about who God is, given horrors, as well as apologetics that is focused towards non-Christians, because Christians themselves struggle with these issues. So I guess I've just been learning a whole lot over the last few years about how important this theme is.
Yeah, and that leads directly into the kind of 2 directions I wanted to discuss, which is why the Trinity, because you focus on the Trinity as the repairer here, and then also at some point I would like to hear how you think theodicy fits into this, or do we need to remap what we think about theodicy in light of this?
Yeah, so I guess after doing a horror reading of Matthew, you're kind of flattened, and you wonder how it is that people can meet the kind of three criteria for moving through recovery from trauma, how they can regain a sense of self, a coherent story, and reconnect with the community. You're like, well, how's that going to happen if the Bible itself seems to reinforce many of these ideas? And there's a very important moment in Matthew's Gospel when Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus says, "Great." And then Jesus provides a contrast between a perspective of flesh and blood and the gift of the Father, which is a new perspective on Jesus. And I take that as a hermeneutical key for distinguishing between a horror reading, which is a reading of flesh and blood, what we're accustomed to in the plane of history, and the gift of the Father, which is a true perspective on Jesus. And Jesus, once Peter admits who Jesus is, he says, well, blessed are you, Peter, okay? And that this is the gift of the living God, this perspective you have. So I call it a blessed reading. That is, God gives us a blessed reading from himself, which is a reading from the living God. So it's oriented towards life, so faith, hope, and love, and recovery. And it comes from the God who is Father, Son, Spirit. That's who he is fully revealed to be at the end of Matthew's Gospel. And because it's a Trinitarian reading and a new offer of life, it means that the dimensions of who Father, Spirit, Son are, one God, and how they work in our lives can be included in understanding how people can recover community, a sense of self, and a coherent narrative. So it means that we're not dealing with a distant God, but the God who is within, who is present with us, and who renews us through the Son and the Spirit. So it must be a Trinitarian reading, and because it's Trinitarian, it's very particular and looks very different to the kind of resources for recovery that might be offered by a secular worldview or a deistic one, an Islamic one, or even a Mormon one.
Yeah, so it's hard to imagine on that account, when you put it that way, to think of just some kind of deity or some kind of divine being actually being able to encounter, address, and repair in horror. And the notion that not only do we have God in Trinity, but that it's a story that we're enjoined into, which remaps the story of the trauma, the traumatized. Like, there's just no way we can now turn this into kind of just have Jesus in your heart.
No way.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. It has to be and is a profoundly Trinitarian story. So, for example, the importance of the incarnation for affirming the value of human persons is key. But the incarnation is a thoroughly Trinitarian view of the world, right? So the incarnation is something that requires the Spirit bringing about the life of Jesus according to the will of the Father. The incarnation also shows us not just the value of persons, but the power of what God can do in humans. And through the incarnate ministry of Jesus, what we see is God who constantly heals. That's one thing that is wonderful about the blessed reading of Matthew. When you look at Jesus' intentions for the world, he's always healing people. He's delivering them from demonic possession. He's delivering them from religious hypocrisy. He wants to set people free to flourish again as God's images for their own good and the good of the other and the glory of God. So when you're attuned to the fact that Jesus actually is God himself at work in history, and this is what the face of God looks like, this is fantastic. And it's radically different from a reading of flesh and blood, the paranoid reading.
That's good stuff. So how would you, since you teach apologetics, I used to teach philosophy of religion at a public university, actually. How would you then reformulate, if somebody comes in with the typical theodical questions, how would you reorientate them given this?
Well, I think one of the big questions with the evidential problem of evil, which is that given the amount of suffering that there is in the world, it's highly unlikely that a good God exists. With respect to that argument, I think you can say that if these texts at all refer to events in history, then it may be the case that despite great horrors occurring in the world, at the same time, there is a God who is doing good things, if these are historical texts. And what I would probably use in a secular context is the Gospel of Luke, because he is the one who has researched the stories, he's got the sources together, and he's tried to put together a coherent narrative of what actually took place. And if you believe that Jesus was at least an exorcist, at least a teacher, at least a prophet, and he aligns himself with God, well, then at least the understanding is that those who align themselves with Yahweh are those who are on the side of healing and life. So that's where I would just begin, without going to the Trinity or anything like that. At least I'd say that Christians believe that God is on the same side as life, and that you can have two parallel lines running through history, death and life at the same time. And I think a lot of people understand that.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I guess that my final question you've already kind of answered, but I want to go back to Fortress, and kind of knowing what we all know now, because it's again you can watch it on YouTube for free, by the way, and it is a little dated. I looked at it now. I looked at it in preparation for this, and I thought, okay, it's not quite as scary as I remember it, but I understand why a 10-year-old me was terrified of this. But what is it about a horror movie like that, especially like that, where it's just men doing evil things to children and women? But what is it about that actually is so terrifying? What funds the terror and the trauma there?
I think that what funds the terror in lots of horror movies is the sense that perhaps you can be taken away from everything that makes your life safe. So the starting point is you're removed from family, society, schools, all those attachments that give you safety, and you're in a situation that's profoundly unsafe and at the mercy of evil people. And the thing is, we can all imagine that. It's not inconceivable that we get abducted. And it can be at the bank, it can be on a holiday, it can be at a friend's house, it can be at any time. So what makes it scary at first is the sense that safety is gone and that you're isolated and you may be overwhelmed by someone else. And what the Christian gospel says is that through his Spirit, God attaches you to himself, and that Jesus is always that safe person to whom you're attached. So Jesus gives you that grounding. So for me, that basic fear that we have is modified by the fact that Jesus is always a safe person for us to be attached to through his Spirit, even when we are locked away, incarcerated, abducted, beaten up in a car park. The bottom for Christians isn't as deep as it is for non-Christians, because we're never alone. So part of what makes those movies scary is shaved off a bit by the Trinitarian message of God's presence with us. The other aspect is that when people are abducted and isolated from others, their power to act as images of God isn't there. And I think that that's incredibly frustrating, and at some point we all give up. I mean, it's like when you're at a workplace where you're constantly undermined, right? 3 years in, you just give up making proposals, right? And in life, as we are worn down by horrors, commonplace ones as well as gross ones, we just give up. And that breeds a sense of meaningless and purposelessness. And you see it in these horror movies about 3/4 of the way through. The people are grotty, they're in a corner, they're tied up, their heads are bowed down, and they even turn on each other. They're done. And so that's what horror movies make us realize, is that horrors and trauma just wear us down as people. And the good news of the Christian message is that we are called to shine like stars in the Father's kingdom, and that God can heal us to the point where we are God's face to one another. And that's one of the main points of the book, is that God is revealed indirectly through Christians to one another. So when you're kind to me, when you're patient with me, I actually see God's qualities at work in my life. So the big call on Christians from this book is to be there for one another as God's face when we reveal his qualities, which is totally the opposite from what we see in horror movies, where the face is scary, it's covered up, it has weird makeup, it's distorted with anger. So human faces go from scary in horror movies to kind and loving in the Christian gospel. And that's one of the main points of the book, is to be Christ-like to one another, to aid each other's recovery.
That's powerful. It was when I was in the military. It struck me as funny yet not funny that I couldn't figure out why when I was deployed, in Colombia, I was working counter narcotics. I'm out in the middle of the Amazon jungle on a little operating base with 30 other people, and I'm out pulling guard duty. And I couldn't figure out why, as an 18-year-old with a loaded rifle, I was scared of the dark. It just didn't make any sense to me. And it was actually much later when I was married and discussing this with my wife, like, why as an adult am I still scared of the dark in certain situations? The alone, the isolated. But I think part of it, too, is my imagination of what can go wrong was fostered by watching horror movies as a young man. And I even, when I was, well, there's another story, but I got shot at by a 15-year-old Honduran conscript once because he thought he saw a ghost, because his imagination had been fostered by a horror movie. And so he took a shot at a ghost, unironically, I guess. I'm like, you realize how ghosts worked if you believed in those kind of things. These aren't neutral or merely entertaining vehicles in our society. They're actually trading on something very deep within the fall, I guess. Yeah, definitely. And a number of philosophers say that, and this is in the book, that the horror genre and a horror-tuned reading of reality is actually a good thing, because it unmasks your assumptions that you can drive to work and back every day and you'll be fine. When the fact is, actually, the more you do that, the more likely you are to have a terrible accident, lose a leg, or die. So horror is actually an epistemological good and is quite a helpful thing in grounding our assumptions and keeping us in this life with our feet on the ground. The problem is, if that's true, then what does that mean for how we live purposely and without losing hope? You have to have a Christian belief. Otherwise, you will succumb to the reality to which horrors actually point. Yeah. Okay. Are you ready for the speed round? Yeah, sure, mate. I listened to this podcast, and the thing I have been preparing for the most hasn't been rereading the book, but it's been the horror round. I mean, not the horror round, the speed round. Yes. Let's call it the horror round for today. Okay, yes. Well, it will not be horrific. Okay, so this is going back to your roots, because I think you and I are about the same age. What would you consider the most influential band or album that was not on MTV or the radio when it was released? I would say The Cure, Pornography. Wow, good one. Yeah, that was part of a trilogy that dealt with disintegration as its core theme. Excellent. Okay, can we talk about Crocodile Dundee for a moment? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all right. National hero. Okay, what's up with it? Is he known by Australians? Crocodile Dundee, absolutely. Yeah, really? Sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And then there's a more recent guy who sadly died when a stingray stabbed him through the guts. But Crocodile Dundee is real, and there are enough people like him that you sense that you've seen him a lot of times. Okay, so people don't, like, they're not embarrassed and like, oh, we're not really like that. They say, okay, yeah, I know that guy. That's an uncle of mine. Well, it's like he is the part of us that we try to hide under suit jackets when we go to SBL and AAR. Excellent. But if you've ever hung out with Mike Bird, for example, or myself, you know that there's a funny kind of larrikin sense to us, and that's what Crocodile Dundee is. He's the adventurer in us all. Well, he certainly shaped my conception of Australia at a young age. Okay, at Society for Biblical Literature annual meeting, are you going to go this year? Oh, unfortunately, I'm not, but I'll be there next year. Oh, you're missing the best year. It's in San Diego. Yeah, right. Yes, okay. I've been to San Diego before, and I loved it when I was there. I actually follow the San Diego Padres in the baseball, because they're Padres, right? Because I'm an Anglican priest. And then I got to San Diego and I looked at the stadium and I was like, okay, this is why they never win anything. Point of fact, I had forgotten that team even existed until you mentioned them just now. I think the last time I heard them mentioned was like in 1987 or something. Sure. No offense to our San Diego. Okay. Oh, yeah. Going back to Crocodile Dundee for a second. Have you ever been to Dundee, Scotland, upon which I assume Dundee... Oh, okay. No. I've never been to Scotland. No idea. Oh, okay. Really? Never been to Scotland? Oh. I have to visit those folks at Logos sometime. Yes. Okay, so Society for Biblical Literature annual meeting. So when you do go, what do you most look forward to and what do you most dread?
Well, I think the thing I look forward to the most is the whip and stock dinner where people like you and I get to catch up and speak long into the night. I go every year. This is the first year I'm not going. And the thing I enjoy is the panel presentations. So like this year I did some stuff on comparative hagiography across religions. And that is just so stimulating intellectually as an academic, dealing with other people from other perspectives. I love that. I also love catching up with people that I studied with. So last time I was at San Diego, we had some beautiful, breezy seafood tacos with old friends, and it was just wonderful to hear about their families, look through their phones, look at the photos of what's going on. That's great too. So there's a lot to love about these meetings, and they really are a highlight for me. Yeah.
Yeah, so now what do you dread? Besides I assume you have significant jet lag.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to mention, is the fact that you're supposed to arrive after not having slept much at all and be compass. But in fact, I'm often incomprehensible as an Aussie anyway. And then you add on, being awake for 40 hours, you never know which crocodile Dundee's going to emerge. Yeah. I tell you, the thing I do dread is realizing that perhaps I'd misunderstood someone. So if I'm on a panel or, say, responding to a book, or giving feedback to another paper, just because of the distance from Australia and we don't bump into people that much and the time difference, means that you're not kind of getting people's vibe all the time. So my big fear is that I've misread someone and that I would be sort of rude or something like that. So that's my big fear. And I think that's why going to SBL and so forth is important for Aussies and New Zealanders and South Africans who are far away from the centre of the action, just so you can spend time with people and get a good sense of who they are before you start engaging in constructive critique.
Oh, that's good. That's good to know. I mean, I always presume from the outset I am misreading them, and this is just the way it goes. I haven't found a way to get around it because I'm just not perceptive enough to find another way. So that's okay. Members of the body. Okay, I have 2 Jeopardy-style questions for you. You're familiar with Jeopardy and how the game show works?
No.
Oh, okay. So this is easy. I'm going to give you, in this case, I'm just going to give you a list of things, and then these are the answer, and you're going to give me the question.
Okay.
So if I said, tomato, pear, apple, you'd say, what are fruits?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
So here's your first set of answers that you're going to give me the question for. Michael Bird, Michael Bublé, Phyllis Tribble, Tom Cruise.
Best looking people in any environment. Who are the best looking people in any environment?
I like how you corrected yourself.
Yes.
Because I was going to have to say, oh, I'm sorry, in the form of a question.
Yes.
No, these are 4 people who have never been in my kitchen. Good try, though. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you need to have them. Yep.
Next one is rotten herring, fermented broad beans, head cheese, and balut.
What are the best aspects of German cuisine?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. The question we were looking for was 4 things that taste better than Vegemite.
Nothing tastes better than Vegemite, man. We have that all the time.
You want to hear this? This is like, I consider my epic joke of the century. Is somebody had brought Vegemite and left it in the faculty kitchen where the students come in and sneak stuff out of there when they shouldn't. And so I ripped off the label of the Vegemite and replaced it with Nutella. And because it looks almost identical.
Yes.
And,
jeez. That's a good one.
And I waited for reactions, and I only heard secondhand how people reacted. But
is that where you're interested in horror comes from? You were a horror maker, mate. Well, getting someone to eat Vegemite unwittingly.
You know that feeling when you eat it, or like if you just get some in your mouth, when somebody says, hey, try this, and you get it in your mouth, and then you realize that nothing you drink will get that taste out of your mouth.
That's right.
It smears and gets in the creases, and you actually have to go in manually. Yeah. You need a spoon to get it out.
Yeah, exactly.
So you know this question's coming is, what do you think the most significant book in biblical studies or theology of this last generation is?
I think it would be one of the works by T.F. Torrance on the Trinity. So the Trinitarian faith, for example. On the Catholic side, it would be Karl Rahner's Theological Investigations, because he was trying to work in a cross-disciplinary manner and speak into a new situation after Vatican II.
Perfect. Yafeh, as they say in Israeli Hebrew. Okay, what's the, that means like beautiful.
Okay, all right.
What's
great.
the funniest one-liner joke you know?
The funniest one-liner joke I know? I am really good at dad jokes. What's that?
It better be hilarious.
Mate, I don't have one. I'm so sorry. I'm a huge fan of puns and jokes on the run, so I don't have any memorized jokes, but if you spend enough time around me, you'll know that I'm great at dad jokes.
Okay, I gave you an opportunity.
Yeah.
Do you want to hear my favorite knock-knock joke?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, you start.
Knock-knock. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
Who's there who?
You got me.
Oh, okay. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
Interrupting care.
Interrupting care?
No, okay, wait, we're going to do this again. Okay. Do you
I know the joke. Yeah.
You're a bad man. Okay, knock.
Who's there?
Howdy.
Howdy who?
How do you like to open the door for me?
Oh, that is bad. That's horrible. You know what the secret to comedy is? Timing.
Yeah. You just killed me with those pauses back then. You're good at it.
I'm abusing the distance between us and Australia. So, okay, last question, but it's a significant one. I'm especially interested to hear your answer to this. Is what idea in theology or maybe biblical studies would you like to see go the way of the dodo bird? Do you think it's been unhelpful or a corrupting influence, possibly?
Yeah. Okay. Look. This may be a little unpopular, but I think that in systematic theologies, if you start with any other basis other than the doctrine of God, I think you're setting yourself up to misunderstand fundamental aspects of reality. Classically, you would begin with the doctrine of God and all things as they relate to Him, which means that you bring God's will, qualities, attributes, and purposes to bear on everything that is subsequent to it. There's been a move recently to begin systematic theology, say, with the kingdom or the gospel, the good news. And I think that is to skip ahead. And it means that you leave off the power of your doctrine of God to deal with issues that come up. So, for example, with horrors, if you'd begun with the kingdom and the gospel, I think you would have really lost out. So for me, the idea that perhaps needs to be critiqued or left behind is the idea that you can do systematic theology without beginning with your doctrine of God. Sorry.
Can I push a little bit more on that? Sorry, that's a good answer. So how do you see the interaction between biblical theology and the doctrine of God specifically?
Yeah, okay, so I guess I like to differentiate between biblical theology as the kind of task that looks at connections within texts, corpuses, and the Bible itself, and systematic theology, which is about connecting the dots and in more of an analytical manner, thinking about what pertains to God, humanity, and so forth. So when we think about biblical theology, I think that we will see ways of talking about God, for example, His name, His actions, covenants, and so forth. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to draw them together into a more coherent picture. My concern is, for example, if you're dealing with a biblical theology of God from, say, Amos and prophets of his time, is that there's an emphasis to do with God's character in those texts that leaves out other aspects of who God may be. And so I think what biblical theology may miss is the fuller picture. And good systematics should give you the whole picture that biblical theology generates.
Well, it's really good stuff, Scott. I thank you for putting pen to paper or finger to keyboard and cranking out this book. I think it's very profitable. And obviously, I'm not a systematic theologian.
Come on! I think those distinctions are so artificial, to be honest.
Well, I think for the most part that's true, but I think that there's a lot more work like this that needs to be done in systematic theology. So I hope it stands as a paradigm for others who are coming into tracks.
Sure, no worries. Happy to talk with others. Yeah, mate, thanks for having me on the show. It's great to know you over the years anyway, and I really value the podcast. I listen to it in the mornings on my way to work, and it really is a shot up the arm to think that there's lots of other people there taking biblical studies seriously. So thanks, mate, for putting in. It's great.
We appreciate the plug. If you have any further questions for Scott, you can write them on the back of a $100 bill and mail them to me at the King's College, and I'll forward that question on to him via email. So thanks, Scott. We'll see you next time.
Do that. All right. Thanks, mate.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.